was 10 years old, I was rich. I was an aristocrat, riding around in taxis, surrounded by comfort, and all I thought about was art and music. Now I'm 36, and all I think about is money.
Okay, we're going to start painting soon, but first I'm going to give you some background information. My name's Maxwell and I'm a watercolor painter. Here are some paintings that I've done that I like. This is Edward Hopper. He's a really famous artist. He did the painting Nighthawks, which you've probably seen, but he's also the best watercolor painter of all time. And we're going to be referencing this book and kind of using it as a guide of how we're going to want to paint. This is my color palette. I keep it really simple. For each color, I have a warm, neutral, and cool tone. And then I have burnt umber and Payne's gray as earth tones. So these are the rules that I try to paint by. I want to keep it simple. I don't want to overcomplicate the painting. I want to focus on light and dark tones. I don't really care about color. I want to keep things cooler in the background and then warmer in the front. And I want to paint light to dark, background to foreground. We're going to be painting on arches, 140-pound cold pressed paper. It's 10 by 14, but we're only going to be painting 10 by 8 because that's the size of frames they sell at Michael's, and I don't really want to care about framing anything custom. Okay, I've already painted the painting, and I'm just going to wing some narration over the footage. It took me about 5 hours to paint this, and the footage is playing at 5 times speed. The most convoluted and complicated part of watercolor, to me, is how I'm going to start the painting. I really think about what steps I'm going to take, and that helps me determine if I want to start on the sky or if there's something close to the sky I want to start on. Obviously, the sky is the furthest thing in the background, and it's usually quite light compared to the rest of the painting. So it's normally the first thing you paint, but here I start with the tops of these trees. And there's a few reasons for that. First, I want to paint these directly on white. I want to let the white of the paper shine through, give it a really reflective and translucent look, like the sun is reflecting off the very top. And you could definitely paint the sky and then paint the trees around the sky, but that's not really how real life works. The trees cut off the sky, so I like painting the sky around the trees if they're going to be pretty light. If they're going to be dark, you could always paint over the blue. And another way you could do it is a wet on wet wash, where you just leave those spaces pretty white and light. But that is not the style I'm going with this painting. If you want something more realistic, you would probably do a wet on wet wash, and then as you get closer to the horizon, you would get lighter with your blue. And then you could just dab away light spots to paint those trees. But with this painting, I'm going for a more stylized look where I want just full flat wash of blue for the sky with no gradient. I think that fits the nature of what I'm going for, which is a very washed out autumn scene. And the sky is not really going to be the focus of this painting. And then I'm doing this wet on dry. With a giant area like this, you really run the risk of the paint drying up on you. And then if you try to paint wet paint next to slightly drier paint, you leave streaks in your wash. But if you do it quickly, it's not too bad. And streaks don't really matter in this case, because we do not care about the sky. It's really not an important part of the painting. It could be pretty bad and it wouldn't really matter. With Edward Hopper, he he really does not care about the sky. He will just paint it super dry, just leave tons of streaks, because he understands that is not something we really care about. We care about how light interacts with the objects and the different contrasting values that makes. So I'm starting with the lightest part of the painting, which is the left side of the shed. And it's not totally white. There's a little bit of warmth to it because of the sun hitting the side there. So I put some raw sienna and then I just dab it away to leave a little bit of warmth there. Here I'm mixing up one of my favorite colors. It is a gray. And I use ultramarine and burnt sienna. And this gray is really useful because it's super versatile. Depending on if you want to cool it down or warm it up, you could just add burnt sienna to warm it up and then ultramarine to cool it down. I use this probably 80% of the painting is just this color. So this right side of the shed is getting indirect light, so I'm going to paint it in a little bit of a cooler color. And I'm just going to paint the entire side of the shed this one color. I guess the parts of the shed that it's not a window or a door, just the wall. And I'm going to dab some off to just give it some texture. And I notice there's some lighter areas. It's not a totally uniform surface. Before I painted on this or even drew on it, I stretched the paper, and you should always stretch your paper with watercolor. What that does is makes it so no amount of water is going to buckle your paper and leave puddles of pigment. It really removes an uncontrollable variable from your painting. It makes it super easy. Makes it 10 times as easy as if you're not going to stretch. And even here, while I'm not using a lot of water for any of my washes or anything here, it still would buckle slightly if I just taped it directly without stretching. And all it takes is a little bit of planning. You just have to stretch your paper the day before and give it a whole day to dry. The way I do it is with water activated gum tape, and the water activated gum tape I have here has nylon strings in it, and it sucks. What happens is when you tear it off, it all splits into just a mess of strings and pieces of torn paper, and it's a nightmare to get off your board. And every time I order water activated gum tape, they give me this kind, even though I order the type without it. It's really hard to find the correct water activated gum tape. What I'm doing here is just putting a bunch of gray down on my paper and cooling it down and warming it up depending on if it's getting sunlight or how much sunlight it's getting. So with the sidewalk, it goes from very light to dark and then light again as we go left to right. So as it gets more sun, I warm it up, and as it cools down, I add some blue. And the gravel here is very cool, so I add a lot of blue. But I make sure to leave a little bit of white in some spots to simulate light reflecting off parts of the rocks. The paper I use is Arches, and that is the only paper you should ever use for anything. All other watercolor paper is terrible. It doesn't soak up the paint right, and it leaves water resting on the paper, and it does not dry well. I hear people complain that Arches is expensive, and that is really dumb. It's not expensive. It's $24 for 12 pieces of 10 by 14 paper. So it's $2 a piece of paper, but your painting is going to be worth more than $2, bro. I'll even use it as scratch paper. I will do multiple drafts of paintings and then just throw the rough drafts into a drawer. I do not care. Even test paper, if you're making a serious painting and you're really trying to learn, it's going to be worth more than $2 to know exactly how your paint is going to end up on your paper. I am super broke, but I still buy this paper because I would rather be broke than not use it. So I'm using a little bit of cadmium yellow with ultramarine to make a more army color green for this tube. And it seems like all of the fixtures of the shed are painted in that same color, but this tube is getting a lot of light, so I make sure to dab where I paint to leave a nice reflective spot. And this side of the shed is getting a lot of light, so we're making it pretty light. So I'll go more into what we're really focusing on with this painting. We do not care about any detail. We do not care about the fact that it's a shed. We don't care about that. All we are focusing on is how light hits the surface and what kind of shadows that casts and how we're going to replicate that with watercolor. This is really more of a study on light than a shed, because a shed is boring, but light is not. And we just painted the roof. That is some burnt sienna with some red. I used my warm red. I don't really remember the name. And then I added a little bit of blue on the left there because I feel that that area is a little cooler. And we screwed up a bit there, but we just lifted some extra paint with our dry brush. It's not the most perfect flat block of color, but that's not what we really care about. This reference photo is an image I took a few days ago. It is of some sort of water utility shed in my old neighborhood that I grew up in Chico, California. And I always thought this one shed was kind of a strange place. I would pass it by walking to school every day, and I used to think people lived there. Even with the history I have with this shed, I still don't really like it as a reference photo. If I had something better, I would paint that, but you could spend a million years trying to figure out what to paint instead of actually painting. So we will paint whatever. My head gets in the way. I try to change the angle throughout the video because I really like getting super close to my painting so I can see every single detail of the paper and whatever. See? Bro. Okay, and then I knock the camera off my stand. So the door and the window frame are that same army green color, but since they're receiving indirect light, we're going to give it a little bit more blue to cool it down, make it a bit darker. And then we paint that little bit of roof at the very right of the image. That is not our focus of the painting, so we're going to leave it really just a triangle of brown. We're not going to put any detail into that. Now we could go a little bit darker with that inside tree. We still want to keep it super abstract. Those trees are pretty far away from where the camera is, so they're not going to have a lot of detail. And we're going to leave those for the very end because there are parts of those trees that get super dark, especially on the left. We're just going to add a little bit of highlights. And with the trees, you want to leave some white between the blue of the sky and the tree to really give the trees and the leaves a reflective look. I like to think that the sun at the very edge of the leaves just perfectly reflects off them. Now that we've painted all of the lightest parts of our painting, we're going to start transitioning into our medium tones. And this is a really difficult part of the painting. You don't want to go too dark because you could only go so dark, and once you reach the darkest parts of your painting, you don't want your medium tones and your darkest darks to take away from each other, I guess. And you don't want to paint them too light for the same exact reason. You want them to stand out on their own. And usually these are shadow colors, so you want them to be dark enough so they give the appropriate shadow to whatever is casting that. Apart from light, the second most important thing about painting is actually drawing. Your painting could suck and be imperfect, but as long as your drawing is good, it'll be fine. And then as long as you get perspective and proportion down in your drawing will be fine. But that is probably even harder than painting or doing anything. Because painting watercolor is super easy, that's why I like it. It's super easy and it's super cheap. I like spending all my money on paper and the rest on beer. Alright, we are getting into a super serious part of the painting now, where our attention to light and shadow really starts coming into play. We want to get the shadow just right. We want it to be the perfect darkness, because that is the entire point of this painting. We are doing a study on that. I probably could have gone a little bit darker there, I think. Because that is going to dry a little too light. Another one of my techniques is I basically draw with my eyes closed. I squint the entire time. I want the reference photo to be a complete blur while I stare at it. So all I see is shapes and light. I don't even want the fact that this is a shed to enter my head. We are not painting a shed, we are painting the shapes that make up the shed. And then this little plaque on the shed actually serves as a nice little break where we don't have to paint that entire giant shadow at once. And I will do that if I can, because it makes it easier. Painting big, dark areas all at once, you really run the risk of your paint drying on you. So if you could split it up into smaller parts, it's a lot easier. Every object you want to split into your light tones, midtones, and dark tones. So we're adding our midtone to our tube. Making sure to leave a nice reflective oval there because it is a metallic reflective surface. So I mentioned that Edward Hopper book at the beginning, and the reason I use that as a guide is because I'm trying to study light here, and to me, I think Edward Hopper is really the master at how light interacts with the real world. And I could show some images from that book that really demonstrate that, where things are pretty abstract, not a lot of detail, but the light and the values are just absolutely perfect. And I could go on about light forever, but that really is the most important part of painting. To me, color does not matter at all. Even temperature barely even matters to me, but you could paint something in one color, one temperature, and as long as you get the light values correct, it will look good. You just have to get the color remotely close to what it has to be. And once you at least get that, but you get the light levels correct, it'll look good. So I go and complete the shadow on that side of the shed. This is a really important part of the painting. It's a nice, interesting shape, and it really sells the three-dimensionalness of the shed. It gives it a lot of depth. So you got to get this shadow right. And you really got to squint and just focus on that shape. And I could see that the shadow is a little bit warmer on the left as it goes to the right. But I don't care about that because I care more about light than the temperature. And where I could emphasize how shadows are cast by making just a giant block of the same color, I will do that instead of adding temperature. I really only use temperature to create depth in the painting. So things that go further away get a little bit cooler. Things that are in the foreground get warmer. I painted this shadow of the windowsill a little too vibrant, so I made it a little bit muddier with some blue. And details like the shadows under those bolts on the window, you don't gotta care about those. I just make a little smudge of gray under them, and that's all you need. And then what I'm doing with this door shadow is I'm splitting it up. It's hard to do like a giant block of dark color that's simple, that also connects with a more complicated shape like the shadow of that door handle. And I think I could get away with painting them one at a time. And I'll just try to match them up later. And what I'm doing here is I'm drawing this little utility box next to the tube. I really didn't want to draw that because I think it looks really cartoony and kind of dumb because it's like a terminal or control box. I don't know. But I realized I didn't want to paint the back of that tube even more. I think that would have looked even stupider. And if you squint at the reference photo, you really don't even notice that little control panel. So I'm going to paint that all gray, just really close tones of gray. And then as I add more dark grays around that, it's going to blend in. I paint this shadow part of the tube, and I make sure to leave some white for those bolts because I kind of imagine the sun hitting them as they jut out. And then I'm going to go back and add some blue into those holes of the tree to let this sky come through. But you still want to leave a little bit of white where you can. make those leaves seem reflective. There is a roof back there of another house. I make that a really cool gray to push it back into the trees. I'm mostly using only warm colors this painting because it is a really sunny fall day in November, so it has a lot of warm temperature to it. And ultramarine is actually a warm blue, but blue itself is a warm color, so you could add it to cool things down. If you're using multiple blues, you would want to use your cooler blues in the background and then warmer blues as you came closer to the camera. But so far we've only used like 5 colors, 5 different paints this painting. Because we do not care about color, we care about light. And with light, I don't just mean the light parts of your painting, I'm talking about, I don't know, the light to dark range of your painting. In the past, most of my paintings that I thought were terrible sucked because I did not go dark enough. There was only light and midtones, and they were not dynamic, and they were flat and boring. There are some parts of the reference photo I do not paint. I don't paint the 2 chain link fences on either side of the shed because I really don't want to. And I think it would look actually horrible if I tried painting that. I don't even know how I would paint that, so I just don't draw them. And with this plaque, it's in shadow. I could tell that it's yellow, but since it's in shadow, we really want to cool it down. And I think I just used some Payne's Gray to do that because I don't want to add a blue to cool that down because it'll turn it into a green. And Payne's Gray is actually a very blue gray, but it's still less blue than a ultramarine or anything like that. And then here we get into a very nerve-wracking part of this painting. What I do is I have 2 brushes in my hand at all times at this during this portion. I use the large round brush to get a lot of pigment onto the paper, and then when I get into a corner or more detailed area, I spread that paint out with the small round brush. It's really important to not let water get pooled up on your paper, and that is easy to do when you're using a lot of pigment and trying to make something really dark. You want it to be very even and no water pooling up at the edges because that will leave a super hard line. And now I'm transitioning into darker colors, getting darker as we paint. And you do that because you can only layer darker paint onto lighter paint. You will not see paint if you paint something light on dark. Another important thing about layering is you want to paint drier as you paint more layers on. You want to add less water because if you put really wet paint on top of other paint, it's going to reactivate it and then mix with the layer you just painted, and it's going to come out muddy. So if you just paint dry, it won't lift as much paint. And then you also don't want to layer any more than 3 times because it will end up muddy anyways. But that's all we really need, because at most we're going to be having a light tone, mid-tone, and dark tone. And we're going to paint this trim on the roof. If you squint, you could tell that it's darker than the shadow on the door. And it's a little bit more blue, or more of a turquoise color, so I add more blue. And I can immediately tell that it is too light. If you look at the painting, it is lighter than the shadow on the door. So we're going to go over that once it dries. And then we're going to add just some detail where things cast shadows. And you don't have to worry about this. You could just do it in one really quick brush stroke. It makes it more interesting if you do it quickly and make it more natural, I guess. And then there is a little part of the shed on the right that comes out, but it's in the shadow of the shed and it's behind the shed, so we're going to make it really blue and dark so it just falls back. Same with that box on the left of the shed. We're going to add a lot more blue to our green. As well with the tube. Do the same thing. And shadows on different objects are all going to be different colors. So you don't want to just paint a gray over a green over another gray. You want to paint a darker green over a darker green, or a lighter green. So with this darker tone on the door, that is a really dry brush. There's not water on that. Once we get super, super dark, we're basically just going to be putting straight paint onto the paper. Yeah, see how much better that looks when we add some dark to that trim? Really brings it forward. When painting watercolor, it's also really useful. If you paint something difficult where you've never really done it before, it's good to write down how you did that. Like here, I'm recording a video, so I remember, but there's paintings that I've done and I look back and I have no idea how I did half of the sky washes I've done. I don't remember if they were wet on wet or wet on dry. Anything like that. So I have to relearn how to do something like that. You really want to treat watercolor like it's a subject you're studying in school. Take lots of notes and remember what paints you used, how much water, used for specific parts. So with that control panel, this is going to be all gray. So I don't want to bring any attention to it because you can't really notice it in the reference photo, but it's still there. And then with the, baseboards of the shed, I notice on the photo, if you squint, you can see a really highlighted part at the top. So I darken those baseboards to kind of bring out that highlight. And then at the bottom of the door, there's a little piece of metal, and you can make that metallic looking by just adding some high contrast gray with the white of the paper. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to paint that California logo or just do like a blue dot, but I think it would look better if I did, so I just draw it on here. And it turned out looking kind of sweet. It doesn't really need to be detailed. Just paint the very abstract shape of California so you know where we are. And with a super dry brush, we add some more dark to the top of that trim. And to separate the shed from the ground, we add a bit of shadow. Another really important part of this painting is the shadows the posts make. And this is something I really wanted to get right. There are certain parts of the painting you could be really loose with, but there's other parts you gotta lock in, and I am locking in here. I don't really care about making these totally straight because it is casting a shadow on an uneven ground and the posts themselves are not totally straight, so you could make it a little bit rough. And then here I screwed up. I had too much water and I tried adding some more pigment there and it bloomed out. So I just picked it up with the paper towel. And we're going to let that post dry and then kind of use a painting restoration technique where we just try to perfectly match the rest of the shadow. And we're going to lift it up. And then with a pretty dry brush, just match it. And then there's a little line that separated the rest of the shadow, and we just picked that up with a dry brush. It's fine if you paint something and it doesn't look good, you could just lift it with a paper towel, but you really don't want to overwork your paper, and you do that by painting something, letting it dry, and then really trying to scrub it off with water. That will actually destroy the fibers in the paper, and those fibers will suck up the water of your paint and just make a terrible effect. And you could overwork your paper by trying to lift too much or by adding too much paint, layering too many times. So you only get a few tries with watercolor. So I like to paint really suburban scenes that have a lot of nature combined with some architecture, because that is what I grew up in, that is all I know. So that is what I paint. You should really only paint things you truly understand. Like me, I truly understand the shed. I don't like drawing or painting people. I really get tired of people. And I am a person, so it's just not interesting to paint. I only care about painting light and dark. So, just by looking at the reference photo, I could tell the most important part of this painting is going to be that shadow to the right of the shed cast upon on the fence. That is the darkest thing in the painting, and it's huge. So it is going to stand out, and we're going to have to paint that absolutely perfectly, or else the painting is going to suck. It's going to really sell the painting. So I am just leaving that to the very last second. Even this sidewalk where the shadow is cast, this super dark gray, the fence itself is darker than that. So you just really have to have courage to go dark. You cannot be scared. In the past, I would have been scared. Not anymore. And on the left, we're going to add a nice cool gray for our gravel. I used my small brush here and I couldn't carry enough pigment and water on it at the same time. So when I painted it, it dried too quickly and ended up looking really chalky. So we're going to lift that up because it looks really bad. And I didn't lift it up in time, so we are going to have to use some water to lift it up. And now I am freaking out because I don't want to overwork this part. I am trying to get it just perfect. and I'm switching to the large brush. 2 brushes in hand to switch. There, as we get to the edge, I use the small one, and I even screw that up. And now I am dying. Like, bro, I am choking. But I ended up saving it, and it doesn't look bad. With something like this painting, I don't really like the reference photo. I don't think it's too interesting, but another reason to just paint whatever is I actually really like the way this painting ended up. I think it's one of my better ones. Arches paper also kind of resists overworking just because of its quality. It holds better together. And the sizing, which is kind of what controls how much water goes into the paper, it's made out of natural sources. So when you're painting on it, your painting smells like fish. It's really horrible. I thought something was wrong with my paper the first time I got it, because it smells like the ocean. And then here, to paint this antenna, it's really detailed. This is probably the most detail I go into here. And I don't want to rest my hand on top of my wash, because your hand is actually covered in a lot of oil, and then if you put that on paint, it'll mix and make really weird spots. So I just put a piece of paper over my wash and then rest my hand on that. I could make a bridge with my other hand and then put my painting hand on that, but for something this long, like the arm of this antenna, I want to put my hand on something sturdy. And I even think I kind of overdid it with the detail here, especially on those little parts of the actual antenna. I think that could have just blended right into the sky. This shadow of the antenna arm on the roof, you don't really see it in the reference photo if you squint, but I really wanted to add it because I think it really highlights the washed out nature of this painting I'm going for. The style, just really sun-baked, really crisp shadows. Here, there's a section of that fence on the left, and it is just a little bit lighter than the section of that fence on the right. So it makes a really good test run for me to figure out the color and how dark I really want to go on the right. And then here, I think I'm going for it. And at this point, while I'm painting, I know this is the most important part. This has got to be super dark to put everything into context and just sell the painting. And I could already tell I have screwed up and it's way too light. But it is going to be better to go over it than to try to lift it and redo it. And I remember while I was painting this, I was freaking out at this point. I just kind of watch it as it dries and then put some bullshit parts into the painting, because all I'm thinking about is that fence. You got to stop yourself from dilly-dallying and painting like this. Like, do those shadows in the sidewalk need to be there? No. I just didn't know what to paint because my mind was on other things. So I'm just kind of wasting some time and going over some shadows to bring some more features of the shed closer to us, give them a little bit more depth. Especially that window, it looks pretty flat. And I'm gearing up to go back over that fence now. Even this is a little too light. It could have been darker. But I'm not going to go back over it again because I think that would be overworking the paper too much. And I'm just getting my head super close to the paper because I just staring at that paint drying. And I remember I was super iffy about this, so I stopped painting and I took a walk and just thought about it. And it did dry a little lighter, but if you squint, it is still darker than the sidewalk, which it's supposed to be. So it's still not terrible. It's okay. As long as you keep things correctly in relation to each other, your painting will come out fine. You really want to make sure to take breaks while painting, especially with watercolor. You want to make sure things dry before you paint even close to them. If you touch something still damp with paint, it will bleed in and look horrible. And I take breaks after every single stressful part of the painting, just so I could fucking take a breath. Painting is really not a relaxing thing for me. My brain is in overdrive and my cortisol is spiked. But now that we've gotten the hardest part of the painting over with, we are really in the home stretch here, with really only the trees in the background being left to paint. And I know I said you want to paint back to front, but these trees are pretty dark. So you always kind of gotta figure out whether you want to paint something back to front or light to dark. Another thing I use that Edward Hopper book for is trees. I kind of suck at painting trees, and anything that makes them easier, I will use that. And these trees are pretty far in the background, so we could be abstract with them. Edward Hopper, he paints his trees kind of crazy. He will just put straight lines. He'll just make squiggles of paint, very abstract. And he'll use just straight paint with very little water. The trees are just not the focus here that we care about. I use a little bit of a more blobby technique where I'll just put blobs of paint down for the trees. And I just try to make sure I have the correct darkness of paint, and then I'll just kind of go crazy. And then you really want to mix up how you hold your brush and then the angle of attack of how you go at the paper. That will create more natural kind of looking blobs. I will even put straight edges and right angles into my blobs mixed up with more kind of natural curves. And I think that makes it look even more natural. It can't be too blobby. It's got to have some sharp spots. And at this point, I just have kind of very loud, fast music playing. So I force my brain to be more loose and not overthink this. And just be conscious about how much water is in your brush, because you don't want to put a blob down and then have too much water and then it dries with hard edges. as the water kind of sits on the paper and dries. So here it's a little too watery, but it ends up being fine. It does dry with some sharp edges or hard lines on the edge, but like I said, that is not really what we care about in this painting. Little things like that don't matter. This yellow tree, I'm really focusing on it because it is quite light, but it also has a giant dark spot, and I just want to get that right. So it takes me a few tries. On the very right tree, I do get a little too crazy with it and have to redo some spots. It's really easy to get too complicated and make too many details in trees like this that really don't need it. Because in your head, trees have tons of leaves and you want to paint stuff like that, but that's why you have to keep your eyes squinted so you just see blobs and shapes. And I want to add a little bit of a midtone to that yellow tree. Like here, yeah. I'm getting way too crazy with that spot and it's starting to look bad. But look how sweet that little shape in that yellow tree looks. That is perfect.
Perfect.
And I'm just adding a really nice cool gray for that wall of the house, just so it really falls back and blends in with the trees. We're going to add a bit of a midtone to the trees on the left. There's not a ton of midtone because it gets super dark, but at the tops of these trees we'll add some. And I think I just end up painting this basically over the entire tree and just going over it again, just to make things super dark. And then here on the right tree, I lift up that spot that I don't like. I got too crazy there. Too much detail. And I'm glad I did that because it ended up looking pretty good. We're going to add our midtone on the left tree. We're going to leave some white though. You always want to leave some white just to make things a little bit more visually interesting. Yeah, that's a nice shape on the red or the right tree. And then once things have dried, we are really going to go crazy with our dark green. We're just going to scrub the heck out of our paint. We're going to take as much paint as we could take from our paint wells to make a very dense color to the point where there's barely any water. Look how dark that is, man. In the past, I would have left the trees as is, not add this dark. Total noob move. But this darkness is really necessary. And then after this, we are pretty much done. I think I go, once you get all the paint, all the large spots of paint over the painting, you could kind of look back at it and see what needs a little bit more of detail. But you don't want to overdo it. Just touching some things up. And then make sure you sign your painting. I kind of messed up my signature, so I lift part of the B and try again. It's an important part of your painting. You want to give yourself credit. And then here I am removing the paint, or the tape. Gives the painting a nice sharp edge.
We make it look easy.
Look at that. Alright, here's the final painting. It is small and simple, but for what it is, I think it does it well. I actually really like this one. I didn't get lost in detail or really screw up something really too bad. I would go darker with the shadow on the door and the shed, and then I would go darker with the shadow on the right on the fence. I would pretty much make that twice as dark if I could. But if I went over it again, I think it would look bad. So I left it like that. Is this painting a masterpiece? No. I don't think anyone would say that ever. But I think it's nice, and I'd probably hang it in my room.